Hello, Rams. Welcome to another episode of Rams History, and today's topic is the causes of the Reformation. Now, it's the year 1517, and certainly in religious matters, all is not well. There is widespread dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church in many parts of Europe. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, the Catholic Church was off its game, and part of this has to do with the problem that the Church was a monopoly. Monopoly is bad in business, it's bad in religion. Competition is what keeps us sharp. It really forces us to focus on what we're doing, keeps us on our game. And by the 1500s, the Catholic Church has largely had a monopoly in religious matters for centuries. The Church has gotten lazy and the Church has grown corrupt, and these problems are being noticed by many people all across the continent. Now, frankly, some of the Church's wounds were self-inflicted, some of these issues were directly caused by the Church itself, and others were not. Now, we've already discussed one of these self-inflicted wounds, the Avignon Papacy. The Avignon Papacy badly damaged the reputation of the Church at a time when the Church could really least afford it, gave many Europeans the impression that the Church was more interested in political intrigue and material wealth than in saving the souls of its parishioners. And this would have a lasting impact on people's impressions of the Church, and in some ways may have helped lay the foundation for events that would follow. Now, to be honest too, some of the Church's problems were not self-inflicted, were not caused by the Church. For example, the Black Death had a very serious impact on the clergy. The Black Death decimated the clergy as much as it decimated the rest of the population of Europe. As priests performed last rites on the dying or tried to tend to the sick, they took ill and died along with everyone else. And this really cut through the ranks of the Church badly, cut down many of the Church's best and brightest. Now, of course, the Church moved to replace these lost positions, but in many instances, the replacements that followed were not nearly as well qualified as the people that they were replacing. One of the problems facing the Church was uneducated priests. The official Bible of the Church in the 1500s was the Latin Vulgate. It had been the Church's official Bible for many centuries. Now, Vulgate means vulgar. It's the Latin of the common people. The problem, though, by the 1500s is that Latin is becoming increasingly scarce. More and more people by this time in European history are speaking what we call the vernacular. They're speaking the local language. So Germans are speaking German, Italians are speaking Italian, the French are speaking French. Latin is becoming a disappearing language. And this was a problem with priests. Now, if you were educated, of course, you could read Latin, but many of these priests were not. And it was embarrassing for many people to go to church on Sunday and sort of sit there and watch the priest mumble his way through a Latin mass that he barely understood. Now, another major self-inflicted problem within the Church was simony. Simony is the sale of offices. And this was really becoming a serious problem going forward. Many positions in the Church were essentially regarded by people as money-making opportunities. And when an opening became available, there were an awful lot of people who would like to obtain that opening as much as possible. And often this was done through by paying for it. So, of course, what this means is you have people who are really not qualified for the positions they're filling. They simply had the money to buy it. And this is going to become a serious problem because you have people that really don't care about the position, they really don't have any sort of emotional investment in it, and in fact, they may not even be fully qualified for the position they're filling. An issue somewhat related to simony was nepotism. Nepotism is when jobs are given to family members. And in some instances, church positions began to be regarded almost as a family heirloom to be handed down from father to son. This causes a lot of the same problems that simony did. People are getting jobs merely because of who their family members are, rather than because of talent or ability or interest in the position. And nepotism, in turn, is going to lead to additional problems. Now, a major issue was absenteeism, and again, as I mentioned, you have people filling positions for which they're unqualified or in which they have little interest, and as a result, sometimes you couldn't even get these people to show up to work. Now, imagine being a medieval peasant in the 1500s. You spend about 6 days a week doing hard physical labor. The one day a week you have off is Sunday, and of course, even on Sunday, you have to get up early to go to church. So you make this effort, you get up on your day off, you go to church, and then the priest isn't even there. Imagine the anger that must have inspired in so many people. You know, I showed up to church, why can't he? And absenteeism was not just a problem at the local church level, it was a problem all across the church in all various positions. And this issue, perhaps more than the others, was the one that got a lot of people upset because this was one that the common people could sort of see with their own eyes. Now, perhaps the most serious issue was the sale of indulgences. This is the one issue more than anything else that really angered Martin Luther. Now, Luther believed that salvation could only be achieved through faith. Now, what indulgences were was essentially a forgiveness of sin. The belief was that if you died with sin, your soul would go to purgatory. It would spend time in purgatory until it was cleansed of sin and could enter heaven. So, of course, what many Catholics were looking for was this forgiveness of sin. Now, traditionally, forgiveness was done through penance and good works and things like that. Indulgences, however, were originally granted by the Pope. Now, the belief was that when Jesus lost his life on the cross, he created this extra sort of reservoir of grace. This reservoir of grace was controlled by the Pope. Remember, the Pope is Christ's vicar on earth. And the thinking was that the Pope could dispense some of this grace to sinners who needed redemption. And this was known as indulgences. Now, originally, indulgences were simply given out by the Pope, but by the 1500s, they'd become a fundraiser. People could purchase them. They'd buy an indulgence, and they would get this piece of paper claiming that a certain amount of sin had been washed away. This angered Luther because, in his mind, this was basically cheating people. The church was taking their money, but in effect, they were getting nothing in return. Their souls were not going to be saved. And their time in purgatory was not going to be reduced. But this really angered Luther particularly, because there was a large sale of indulgences to try to build a basilica in Rome for St. Peter. Now, another factor to consider is that Martin Luther was not the first guy to complain about these issues. In fact, there had been others in the past. For example, John Wycliffe and John Huss had been complaining about some of these same issues all the way back in the 1300s. However, the church was able to effectively silence them by essentially labeling them heretics and then putting them to death. This was typically how the church dealt with any kind of dissent. Anyone who openly criticized the church or who strayed from church teachings was labeled a heretic and put to death. And for a very long time, this was a pretty effective way, sort of keeping the lid on any kind of controversy or criticism of the church. However, by Luther's time, things have changed. Right? Gutenberg's printing press was now available. And what that meant is that the printed word could spread far more rapidly than ever before. So when Luther's ideas are published, they're very quickly printed and they're gradually spread all across Europe. So even if Luther were to be put to death, which he was not, fortunately, his ideas would still be out there in the bloodstream. So the church has a problem. Luther is spreading these ideas about the church and the problems the church is facing, and really the church has a very difficult time trying to silence him. So ideas put in motion cannot be stopped so easily anymore. And certainly in the Holy Roman Empire, there was a very angry young monk who had an awful lot of ideas. In the next episode of Ram's History, we'll talk about what some of those ideas were and how Luther began to really permanently change the religious face of Europe. I do hope you enjoyed this installment of Ram's History, and we do look forward to seeing you again. Some questions to ponder in our next slide here, and we'll see you again soon.